So let's begin. I want to start with what's called a nigun, which is a little wordless melody that the Hasidic Judaism, Hasidism, really uses as a spiritual mystical practice. And the idea is that they'll just repeat this wordless melody over and over and over again until it either puts them to sleep or
they become Buddhists.
Or they become Buddhists or something, or they lose themselves. But it's a good way to kind of calm ourselves down and get us into a sort of receptive learning state. Space, yeah. So I'll start with the melody, and once you catch on, I invite you to join me. Now part two. To the beginning. I want to start with a blessing over Torah study. I'm going to do it in Hebrew, the conventional one, and then I want to give one in English, which sort of reflects my philosophy towards learning, Jewish learning in particular, and spiritual learning. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We say Amen.
Amen.
From the cowardice that shrinks from new truth, from the laziness that is content with half-truths, from the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth, O God of truth, deliver us. Amen.
Amen.
So, thank you all for being here. As I said in my initial email, I think maybe more than you all want to learn, I want to teach. This is my passion. Kabbalah is really what brought me back in a lot of ways to serious Jewish spirituality and Jewish practice. Just say a couple of words about that in terms of my background, which I did mention in our last class, but I will remind you all, and those of you who are, you did watch the video, so, but I grew up in a conservative synagogue. I grew up in Temple Israel Center in White Plains, New York. I grew up in Scarsdale, but that's where we went to synagogue. And I found my experience not so spiritual. And I was always a kid who was really into learning and seeking, and I wanted to know the meaning of life. I really did, but I didn't really find any of that in my religious school background, my upbringing. And so I went through a lot of explorations, and I studied Zen Buddhism in Japan, and I ended up learning about Kabbalah when I was about 19 or 20, and it was like a light bulb went off, and I discovered that all of the sort of truths that I'd found in Buddhism were really there in Judaism. They just weren't talked about all that much, and they were Kabbalah, and many of the teachings from Kabbalah. And so that sort of began my path towards serious Jewish study and eventually becoming a rabbi. But I would say that Kabbalah has a huge influence on my life and my Jewish spirituality and where I am today. So I love it. I think it's very important, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here with you all and teaching you. It's something that I love. So I want to begin. I know last time we all said our names, but I'd like to do that again. I'm not super good with names. But if we could all go around and say our names, and this time, last time I asked you to share a metaphor for God that works for you or that doesn't work for you. This time I'd like you, if you can, to share a book that may have had an influence on your life, that was important to you in your life. Because today we're going to be talking about the Zohar, which is basically the seminal text of Kabbalah. So, as I said, Kabbalah had a huge influence on my life. So the Zohar really had a huge influence on my life. So I'll start. I'm Rabbi Ben, and the Zohar, which we'll be talking about tonight, had a huge influence on my life. Do you want to?
Sure, I'm Mike, and the book that influenced my life in the latter part of my life, in other words, when I was 30, was 20 Poems of Love and a Song of Despair by Pablo Neruda.
Right.
Thank you.
I'm Mindy. There are just too many books. My mind is too crowded to give that.
Oh, say 3.
I can't even imagine which 3 I would pick. It would depend on the day and the mood and the whatever.
What about right now? What would
Yeah.
you do?
Right now, let's see. Well, right now I'm actually reading something that a lot of people found very moving and influential, by the neurosurgeon, the young man who died of brain cancer.
When breath becomes air.
Air.
Mm-hmm.
That's enough.
Thank you.
I'm Jim, and also many, I guess David Copperfield, maybe?
Interesting.
Thank you.
I'm Stephanie. I can't think of a book that did, but one book that I just read, which was I really enjoyed, was The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis, about the 2 Israeli psychologists that founded behavioral economics. And it's a really good read in that profiling both what Israel was like when they were there through, and one was a native-born Israeli and one was essentially a Holocaust survivor that wound up in Israel. On top of that, the whole process of decision-making, Michael Lewis just does an excellent job making it accessible to anyone. So
I
Thank
just
you.
put it on my list.
it's a great book.
Hi, I'm Joanne, and I would say all Buddhist books have really resonated with me. The one that stands out would be one of John Kabat-Zinn's, Wherever You Go, You're Yours. And the list goes on. Him and Mark Epstein.
Thank you.
Well, I'm Bruce, and I guess the most influential book I read when I was 12 years old was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And that just because I'm an architect, and my whole life became because of that book. So it was,
Wow.
to say the least, was influential.
Thank you.
My name is Alan, and what comes to mind is Great Expectations.
Thank you.
My name is Erica. I have too many to name. I think some of the works by James Joyce that I really love, sometimes for that, too, Portrait of the Artist, and Dubliners, particularly The Dead. And poetry, I really, really always liked T.S. Eliot.
All the cheerful stuff.
I do not mind if you could.
Cavity is a mystery cat.
Thank you.
The proof run. Oh, it might go back to some.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'm Al, and it's interesting that Bruce mentioned The Fountainhead because maybe the most influential book that I ever read until I completely rejected it, but it affected my early life, was Atlas Shrugged. I started out as a libertarian until I finally realized the world doesn't work that way.
I'm Hope, and the book that popped into my mind was Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook. And tomorrow will be something else.
Thank you.
I have a long list. Book that's currently influencing me is the one I showed you last time, called Repair of the Soul, by Karen Starr. It's about the interface between psychoanalysis and Kabbalah, and the influences of Kabbalah on psychoanalysis. So that's something that's very interesting to me right now. And when I was a kid, two books come to mind of very different quality. One is Death Be Not Proud, John Gunther, and the other is 1984, which I just reread, and whoa, what a reread.
Yeah, I would share 1984 as well. It's one of my most influential books.
Yep.
So thank you all for sharing. So we're going to dive into a book that I think was not just important for me, but I think was of pivotal importance for Judaism as a whole, and the development of Jewish philosophy and Jewish theology throughout the last 1,000 years, which is the Sefer HaZohar, the book of the Zohar. The Zohar means radiance. So I'm just going to start with a little background. I just want to take a step back for a moment, make sure everybody has the books for the class. And does everybody have the timeline that I handed out last time? Bruce, you might not have it.
Yeah, I got a copy.
Oh, you got a copy of it.
Scanned.
Great. Fabulous. So the funny thing that somebody pointed out to me in the last class is that I left the Zohar off the timeline. It was like the most obvious of all the books, but I left it off the timeline. It was an interesting omission.
It's a paradox.
It's a paradox. Well, everything in Kabbalah, right? They talk a lot actually in the Zohar about the concealed the concealed that reveals, or the thing that is concealed that reveals. And so I guess I concealed it so that I could reveal it all. So the Zohar is a very sort of enigmatic book. And as some of you who might have read some of the essential Kabbalah, several of the pieces there are from the Zohar. You might be able to tell that it's sort of not easy reading necessarily, and it's very poetic, and perhaps for that reason you need some sort of guide or teacher to really walk you through it and introduce you to the concepts. We talked, I think I touched last time briefly on the idea that Jewish mysticism was only supposed to be studied by people who were 40 and married. And there are lots of different opinions about that, but the basic idea is one, you might draw the wrong conclusions from it, which is the biggest wrong conclusion is that there are multiple gods. And if you look at Kabbalah, there's sort of these archetypes called sfirot, that if you don't have enough education could be seen as other deities. So that's number one. But number two is it could drive you crazy because you really don't understand what's going on. Or it might just put you to sleep, as some of us might have discovered in our attempts to read this material. And there are many other reasons, but the main idea is that you need a certain amount of requisite knowledge to really even access this material at all. And because it's very dense, number one. Number two, it refers back to other Jewish literature that came before, like the Talmud. It refers back to things from the Torah. So you really have to have a really wide base of knowledge to even get half of the allusions that they're making in the Zohar. This being said, there's a wonderful new translation of the Zohar by the same guy who wrote this book and this book, Daniel Matt, who is sort of a mentor of mine. I helped him as a research assistant on volume 5 of his translation of the Zohar. And it's an amazing resource in that it's half the page is the text, but then half the page is footnotes. And within the footnotes, he kind of gives you all of the references to the allusions that are being made that you might have lost. Or if you just read a passage and you don't understand it at all, he actually explains the passage to you. So if you'd like to make an attempt to read some of the Zohar on your own, I would highly recommend the Zohar Pritzker edition, translated by Professor Daniel Matt. Now it's 13 volumes. You probably don't want to buy all 13 volumes. Maybe just buy volume 1. So now I'm going to give a little bit of history of the Zohar. As I said last time when we went through the history of Kabbalah, there was a sort of mysticism before Kabbalah that the rabbis practiced called Hechalot or Merkava mysticism, which is either palace or chariot mysticism, and it was an attempt to sort of recreate the vision of Ezekiel and God on the chariot, and it's very sort of shamanic in a way, in that the rabbis would tunnel down into the ground by putting their heads between their legs, and they would go into these heavens, like these 7 heavens, and they would ascend from heaven to heaven. And there would be gates that were guarded by angels, and they'd have to say certain passwords to get by each gate. And they'd go all the way up to the 7th heaven, where they'd have an experience of meeting God face to face. And this was sort of rabbinic mysticism, the mysticism of the rabbis. Now, when I say the rabbis, that is about the period 200 CE to 800 CE, something like that. And these are the rabbis of the Talmud, and they had a very sort of outlined mystical path, which is not Kabbalah, which is different than Kabbalah. Now, if you ask somebody from a very traditional background, not sort of a liberal rabbi scholar like me, they'll say, no, it was all Kabbalah. All of it goes all the way back to Abraham, or even to Adam in the Garden of Eden. But the first book that really starts to be Kabbalistic is what's called the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, or the Book of Creation. And I also talked about this book last time. It's a book that can be interpreted in many different ways. It could be a mathematics textbook. It could be a book of philosophy. But it seems very influenced by sort of Greek philosophy and Greek thought, and particularly Pythagoreanism. I don't know if I mentioned this last time. You may or may not be familiar, but Pythagoras had a cult. There was a religious cult of Pythagoras, and they had a sort of mystical outlook that's very similar to some of the things we might read in the Sefer Yetzirah, and eventually actually in the Zohar as well. But the basic idea, which I'll just outline really broadly, and then maybe we'll get more specific as we go on. The basic idea is that there's this sort of infinite God that's beyond time and beyond space, and that this God pours into the world its infinite energy, but it has to become finite, and so it pours it into these sort of archetypes or vessels or energy centers, and I'm going to draw a little diagram over here, so this I'll do it the way the Pythagoreans did it. That's supposed to be an alpha. So this is what's called the tetractys. And the tetractys, here, I'll spell it out. And the tetractys was seen as sort of the most important diagram of the Pythagoreans. This was their kind of emblem. And what it is, if you look at it, is the way that this infinite flows into the world, right? It starts with this sort of oneness, this unity, and then it becomes two, and then the two becomes three, and then the three becomes four. And if you look here, there are 10 points, and in Kabbalah you have 10 sfirot, these 10 archetypes, or these 10 energy centers. And also the way they drew it, they have 4 different levels, and in Kabbalah there are what's called 4 worlds. They say that this infinite energy flows into the world through these sfirot, but these sfirot are divided into 4 worlds. And these 4 worlds, I should also say, there's a Kabbalistic version of this, which is like this. Yud, Yud Hey, Yud Hey Vav, Yud Hey Vav Hey. Anybody know what letters these? What
God?
Right, the name of God. Exactly.
Yes, I am
right.
and I am was some.
It's just Yud Hey Vav Hey, right? It's the name of God that we pronounce Adonai, right? Or that the Christians might pronounce Jehovah or Yahweh. Right? And so this, I got a little sidetracked, but there's actually 4 levels here. And in Kabbalah, there are 4 worlds. There's the world of the spiritual, the world of the intellectual, there's the world of the emotional, and there's the world of the physical. And this sort of flow of the infinite into the world starts from this spiritual place, moves into our intellect, then our emotions, then the physical body, or the physical world. And if you think about it also, this is sort of the way that the human body is, right? So if you take like a person, right, you have the spiritual, which is often associated with the third eye, right, which is sort of this top point. Then you have the intellectual. Then you have the emotional, which is often, like the chest areas, like your heart is where your emotions are kept. And then the physical is, your feet that touch the physical world.
Does that relate at all to the chakras?
Yes, actually. I mean, there's perhaps a direct connection. I mean, there have been direct connections posited between the chakras and the sfirot. It's unclear whether there was any actual. I'm going to go back. Whether there was any actual interchange between Hindus and Jews, but it could actually be a possibility. Now, this is what I would say comes from the Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah puts forth these 10 Sfirot. And the Sefer Yetzirah says that the universe was created through 22 letters, which are the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and 10 Sfirot. And these Sfirot are these 10 energy centers, 10 points, whatever you want to call them. And the letters are the channels that connect them. And the idea is, right, it says in the Torah, how did God create the world? Anybody? How does God create the world? Carefully, yes. Let's go back to Genesis. Yes, right, speaking, right, with words. Right, and the idea is that the words themselves become the things. Right, and that by putting the letters together, these letters, which are these mystical, archetypal sort of things, God was able to create the things themselves. And if you read any folklore or sort of magical books, to know the name of something gives you power over that thing, right? That the name that something's true name is actually sort of part of its essence of what it actually is. And what's interesting, you want to say?
Yeah, I want to know what the letters are. In other words, you're saying that the world was created through these 22
letters.
But what were the letters? We think of a letter as a shape. What were they that they could create a world?
Right. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, right? What were these letters? I mean, they associate it with the Hebrew alphabet, but I think what they are, in essence, are the concepts behind the numbers, right? So, like the number 1 is a number. Mm-hmm. It's also in Hebrew, like the letters and the numbers are the same thing, right? So Aleph is 1, right? So the idea of 1, right, or Bet, right, which is the idea of 2, right? And so so the idea of 1 has all sorts of things that go along with it. Unity, oneness, all of that, right? And then the idea of 2, right, is a very clear idea too, right? You have duality, right? It's a split. It's one versus another, right? It's and then 3. You can go through the letters and each one. And I have actually lots of like occult books, from like early 20th century sort of theosophy, and many of these books talk about the letters of the Hebrew alphabet they use and the numbers, and they associate different concepts and ideas with them. If anybody is familiar, hi, hello, welcome, welcome. It's going good. Come sit.
Is there space for me?
Yeah, sure. You can sit right next to me.
Become the apprentice.
Right, the apprentice.
Oh,
don't worry, I won't fire you.
And association.
That's okay. White fire, black fire. I'll walk in.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right.
So wait, could I just
comment
or see if I'm following you? So that you could really say that it wasn't the 22 letters; it was the 22 things that the letters represented that created the world.
Correct.
Okay.
Right, and if you look at anybody here familiar with tarot cards, right? So tarot cards have 22 major arcana, right? They're what's called the major arcana and the minor arcana. The normal playing deck might come from the tarot deck, but these 22 major arcana are like the major concept cards, in the tarot, and they are each associated with a Hebrew letter, right? There's 22 of them, and that comes directly from Kabbalah, directly from Jewish mysticism. So that, it's the concepts behind the letters that actually would be what God created the world with, right? And so this is sort of a revolutionary idea in the Sefer Yetzirah that God used the letters and the Sfirot to create the universe. Although they might even say the multiverse, which is a new concept that we have now, right? But in Judaism, in Kabbalah, we say the word olamim all the time, which means universes. And so, I'm going to riff a little bit. I hope people don't mind. And by the way, if anybody wants to talk or interrupt me, please feel free. If you have any questions or anything. So in Kabbalah, it says that God created and destroyed different universes before creating this universe, and that we are actually on the sixth iteration of the universe. And there's another idea that God created infinite universes. And so it was already there in Kabbalah. And also the idea of language making up the world, right? This is genetic. This is genetic code, right? That if you look on a microscopic level, there's a language that makes up everything, right? And that language is, adenine, guanine, whatever they are.
Cytosine, thymine.
Thank you. Right. So even in these modern scientific concepts, there are some allusions to these early Kabbalistic concepts. So that's the Sefer Yetzirah. I can also say that. So some people think that the Sefer Yetzirah, as I said, is sort of a mathematics book. Some think it's a book of philosophy. Some say it's the first book of Kabbalistic mystical thought, and then some say it's even a practical mystical book, meaning it's actually a spell book for how to create a golem. It's interesting. It's not just a golem, but it's sort of the world as well. So that's the Sefer Yetzirah. I mentioned last time. Scholars place it anywhere between the year 200 and 800. Traditional people might say it's attributed to Abraham. So they might say it was Abraham. Even traditional people might say, well, the ideas were from Abraham, but it didn't actually get written down until the temple was destroyed in the year 70. And they say, more traditional people might say it was a sort of a secret knowledge that belonged to the priests in the temple. And when the temple was destroyed, they needed to preserve this secret knowledge, so they wrote it down. But we don't actually have allusions to the Sefer. We don't really have a text of the Sefer Yetzirah before the year 800. And so that's the Sefer Yetzirah. And we have another book in between that and the Zohar, which is a big book in Kabbalah, which is called Sefer HaBahir, which I'm not going to talk about much today. But then the Zohar appears in the world around the year 1270, 1280 in Spain. It was found by Moshe de Leon, Rabbi Moshe de Leon. And I also talked about this last time, but it bears repeating since this is a class on the Zohar, that it was attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, who is a 2nd century rabbinic sage, who there are some wacky mystical stories about him in the Talmud, but most likely, according to scholars, it was written by Moshe de Leon himself. And I'll go back to another thing I said last time, which is we have 3 big pieces of evidence to this. The first big piece of evidence is there was a man named Isaac of Akko who was looking for the book of the Zohar, and he met Moshe de Leon, and Moshe de Leon said, yes, I have a copy of it, I'm going to show it to you tomorrow, and then he died. And then Isaac of Akko goes to talk to his wife, and she says, he wrote the entire thing himself out of his head. And he attributed it to Shimon Bar Yochai so that people would take it more seriously. Now, if I want to be sort of in between my scholarly self and my religious self, I would say maybe Moshe de Leon wrote it sort of inspired by the spirit of Shimon Bar Yochai. Or if I want to get a little wacky, maybe he was visited by the ghost of Shimon Bar Yochai.
He's channeled him.
Exactly, he's channeling Shimon Bar Yochai.
Journey to the spirit.
Or maybe he was Shimon in a prior life.
Maybe he was Shimon Bar Yochai. There you go. Now you're getting into it, yeah. Right. So it is an amazing work. It is very large. It goes according to the Torah portions of the week. So it starts off on with an introduction, and then Bereshit, Genesis, and moves through all of the Torah portions. And it's a very large work. So many scholars say, well, it wasn't him himself who wrote it. It was a circle of people around him, with him, that wrote the Zohar. And that's, if you get into scholarly literature, there's discussions about, all of the different possibilities. Also, there are perhaps layers of earlier pieces of it and later pieces of it, and it was probably most likely added on to over the years. The manuscript that is sort of considered the standard that is used by, for example, Daniel Matt is from about 1700. And there are different versions of it. So Daniel Matt, who translated the Zohar, who I mentioned, he had to go through all different versions of the Zohar to find what he thought was sort of the most likely original version. And so he came up with his own version of the Zohar, and it's available for free if anybody reads Aramaic. It's available for free on Stanford University Press Zohar website. So you can just Google Stanford University Press Zohar, and you can find his Aramaic. And for about 700 and some odd days, I was reading a page of it a day with a group of people online, and I was doing an audio recording every day, and I made it to about 700 and I think about 80 days, and then we moved back here, and my life got kind of busy, so I couldn't record it anymore. But it's a very that was 780 days, and I wasn't even halfway through really yet. So it's a very large, very voluminous work, and so that's sort of a little bit of a background of the Zohar. I got this book. I think I assigned you to read some of from today, and this book as well. This book is written by Daniel Matt before he launched into his translation of the whole thing. This is sort of sections of the Zohar. Now, before we start reading, and I'd like to read some passages and maybe discuss them tonight, but before we start reading, I just want to give a little background of some of the concepts of the Zohar. First, I'll say, you know what, I didn't say the three reasons. I said the first reason why it was probably written by Moshe de Leon, which I take pretty seriously about his wife saying. But the other two reasons are that it's written in Aramaic, which was the language that Shimon Bar Yochai spoke. And the problem is the Aramaic is sort of faux Aramaic. It's sort of a made-up version of Aramaic. And there are words in the Aramaic of the Zohar that seem to come from medieval Spanish. And so that's reason number two. It was probably written by Moshe de Leon. Reason number three is whoever the author of the Zohar is seems to get the geography of the land of Israel wrong in lots of places, right? It'll say he went from Lida to Cappadocia, which is like hundreds of miles, but he went like in one day from one place to the other place, which is, either some sort of deep mystical truth that's trying to be conveyed, or a misunderstanding of the geography of the land of Israel. So those are the three reasons. One more point about the Aramaic before I start to talk about some of the concepts in the Zohar. The Aramaic is not so. The Talmud was written in Aramaic, but the Aramaic of the Zohar is not quite as it's not quite as developed. It's the Aramaic of the Zohar is sort of you can tell it's sort of a creation of somebody that they're trying to recreate a language that they probably didn't speak. So that's the Aramaic. So now let's talk about, anybody have any questions or comments on anything I've said so far?
How about Maimonides? Was there an influence at all? Any discussion or research that Maimonides may have had some influence in the development? He was really just the century before.
Well, what's interesting is Nachmanides. So Moshe Ben Nachman, who is
like his son, right?
No, he was a different scholar, but he was sort of opposed to Maimonides. The two of them were kind of different outlooks. Nachmanides was more of the mystical philosopher who perhaps had some influence on the Zohar and maybe later Jewish mysticism. I would say, though, that the concept of God in Maimonides is very close to the concept of the Ein Sof, which is the infinite, which is the concept of God in Kabbalah. Now, there's another Jewish mystic who was born in 1240 in Saragossa, Spain, named Abraham Abulafia. Now, he wasn't writing about the same concepts in the Zohar. His mysticism is sort of different. His mysticism is about using language to get beyond your mind and to induce a state of prophecy from the active intellect. He was highly influenced by Maimonides. And his mysticism was very sort of Maimonidean in a way. I would say that my guess is that if Maimonides saw the Zohar, he would not be happy. Right? Because, one of his main concepts is, if you look at his principles of faith, that God doesn't have a body, and that God can't be described in any physical way. And it would seem in Kabbalah, even though it's not actually a body, but it would seem sort of maybe like that in a certain way.
If you're going to be concrete about it.
Yeah, it's like a little too. It's a little too concrete for Maimonides, right? Maimonides' concept of God is, I think, what's called like via negativa, which means, and we mentioned this last time, and you said a comment about it, which was very good, which is that God is not only anything, right? You can say God is not only red, God is not only green, God is not only blue, right? God can only be described with negatives, and so this is a God that is beyond time, beyond space, beyond really any concept we can nail down.
He's the unmoved mover of Aristotelian logic.
Exactly
and
right.
Maimonides, as a man of science, has been influenced heavily by the Arabic philosophers that he's surrounded by.
Exactly right. Right.
The poetry of the Zohar is just too concrete for him. He can't deal with it. It's because if you look at his poetry, it's beautiful. But if you then give it the spiritual meaning of relating to God, it just takes it too far for him.
Right, and the other thing I would say is, right, he's got a sort of a problem, Maimonides, which is that how does this God that is beyond time and beyond space, beyond any concept, act in the world, number one? How do you pray to that God, number two? How can you connect to that God at all, number three? And Maimonides would say it's through your intellect and through the mind, right? When human beings were created in the divine image, it's that our intellect was created in the divine image, that our intellect is like God. So that's sort of his solution. And if you read, we could have a whole series of classes on Maimonides for sure. But if you're interested, read the Guide for the Perplexed, or maybe read
Parts of it with a friend.
Right, or I was going to say maybe read a book about the Guide for the Perplexed.
I'll go to Wikipedia.
Right, go to Wikipedia, read about it there. Or I'm sure on YouTube there's some lectures about the Guide for the Perplexed you could probably access. But so the Kabbalists had a similar idea of God, right, which is the Ein Sof, right, the infinite, beyond time, beyond space. But they answer the question of how that God can act in the world in a different way than Maimonides. Right? Their answer is sort of that tetractys that I drew. Right? Is that this God made itself a little bit more finite and poured its infinite light into these vessels, which are the sphirot, which are sometimes called emanations from the infinite Ein Sof. And there are sort of some beautiful quotes in the Zohar about how this Ein Sof becomes the Sfirot. And why don't we just dive in and do a little text?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So let's begin. Let's begin with page 38
Which one are we looking at?
of
Red.
the Essential Kabbalah, page 38. Can I get a volunteer to read?
Sure. Where?
And so the one that says water, light, and colors. Now this is not the Zohar. This is from Moshe Cordovero, who's a 16th century Kabbalist, but it describes pretty well the same idea that is in the Zohar about how the Ein Sof becomes the Sfirot, these emanations. So
Right.
go ahead.
In the beginning, Ein Sof emanated 10 Sfirot, which are of its essence, united with it. It and they are entirely one. There is no change or division in the emanator that would justify saying it is divided into parts in these various Sephirot. Division and change do not apply to it, only to the external Sephirot.
And so this is sort of the caveat, right? Don't say that there's any division at all in God, right? It's all one. It's all God. It's all this Ein Sof. There is no division. Right? Because we don't want to be polytheists, right? Keep going.
To help you conceive this, imagine water flowing through vessels of different colors, white, red, green, and so forth. As the water spreads through these vessels, it appears to change into the colors of the vessels, although the water is devoid of all color. The change in color does not affect the water itself, just our perception of the water. And so it is with the Sephirot. They are vessels, known, for example, as Hesed, Gevurah, and Tiferet, each colored according to its function, white, red, and green, respectively. While the light of the emanator, their essence, is the water, having no color at all. This essence does not change. It only appears to change as it flows through the vessels. Continue.
Continue.
Better yet, imagine a ray of sunlight shining through a stained glass window of 10 different colors. The sunlight possesses no color at all, but appears to change you as it passes through the different colors of glass. Colored light radiates through the window. The light has not essentially changed, though so it seems to the viewer. Just so with the Sephirot. The light that clothes itself in the vessels of the Sephirot is the essence, like the ray of sunlight. That essence does not change color at all, neither judgment nor compassion, neither right nor left. yet by emanating through the Sephirot, the variegated stained glass, judgment or compassion prevails.
So let's just take a minute to digest that.
At least.
Right. So the first metaphor is the Ein Sof is like water, flowing through different channels, which are different vessels, which are different colors. Right. And then he's like, well, even better of a metaphor is stained glass, is light coming through stained glass of different colors. Right? It's always the same light. It's just that when it comes through these different colors of stained glass, it appears to be different colors. Does anybody have any reactions to this beyond puzzlement?
Yeah. Reaction. I think the second metaphor is very helpful because it invites you, I think, to consider these different emanations as filters. Mm-hmm. And the essence hasn't changed, but a different filter brings out certain things into clearer focus, and so that's what your attention is drawn to.
Mm-hmm. And the essence, like, if you ask me to say what Kabbalah is on one foot, the essence of Kabbalah is it's all one. Everything is one. We are all one. We are all the Ein Sof, just with different filters, right? I'm the Ben filter right now. Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who is the founder of Jewish Renewal, which is I mentioned last time, a sort of a modern version of Kabbalah, would say, when I wake up, I say, thank God, thank you, God, for deciding to be Reb Zalman today, for putting on the Zalman mask today. Right? I hope I give you a good ride, he would say. Right? And so the basic idea of Kabbalah, if you would take anything away from these classes, is that we are all the Ein Sof, just in different containers, different, what was the word? Filters. Different filters.
So if he would say, thank you, God, for being Reb Zalman today,
he's talking to himself, right?
That's what I'm asking you. So he is talking to himself about the aspect of himself that's the embodiment of that state, that particular state of being godlike in a very particular
or the state of being
way.
Reb Zalman.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying, right. But he is meeting God even as he is
God.
Is God and creating his connection to God.
Correct.
Got it.
It's interesting to me that God, who is infinite and has an infinite number of facets and dimensions, that Kabbalah has chosen only 12.
10.
10, excuse me, 10.
And the 22 and the 22 letters.
Right, because it's an infinite number of facets, and we're picking a finite number to look at.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in different Kabbalistic writings, they'll talk about how, well, each of the 10 sfirot have 10 sfirot within them. And each of the 10 sfirot within them have 10 sfirot within them, right? So in a way, it's just like saying, all right, we're going to pick these 10 categories as the basic 10 categories. It's a similar idea, actually, to the 10 Commandments, right? So, right, God gave us the Torah, God gave us the 10 Commandments. But how many commandments do we follow as Jews?
613.
613.
Yeah.
Correct. All right, we have 613 commandments. We don't have 10 commandments. We have 613 commandments. and if you were to say, well, that's because the non-Jews need to follow. No, the non-Jews actually only have 7 commandments that they're supposed to follow, right? The 7
Noachite laws.
7
right?
Noach.
At Marah, when we were camped out in the desert.
Right, 7 Noachite laws, right? So the 10 actually are the 10 that we're supposed to follow. Well, what they say is it's 10. These are 10 categories, and the 613 fit into these 10 categories, right? And in a similar way, right, we have the 10 Sfirot, but they are just sort of 10 categories.
And then there's also the Sitra Achra. I don't know if you talked about
Sitra
that.
Achra, yeah.
Yeah, which is the dark side of God that has kind of like mirrored Sefirot that are evil.
Right. So let's look at a diagram of the Sfirot here. I think there's one in this book.
It's in both books.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah.
Let's
It
find
shows
it.
us
in the red one.
Opposite the introduction.
Yeah.
Here it is. Okay. Right before page Roman numeral 1. Show the people in Facebook Live the diagram. Right. So this. Gotta have an audience.
Yeah.
Here.
Actually, I saw your show. I saw your live.
A
class.
show. It's a show.
No, your live class. Well, I mean, I didn't see it live.
Right.
So,
You saw
it
the
was
recorded version.
But I heard you retell the story of Pardes.
Right,
I didn't
sure.
see all of it. Did you talk about the mountain man who comes and eats the wheat or the?
No, I did
pastry?
not
No?
talk about that piece.
I'm intrigued.
Although that's a piece from the Zohar that we could actually
Right.
discuss today a little bit. Right, so these are the 10 Sfirot as they're usually diagrammed. The top one is Keter, and I'm going to go through them individually in a moment. But if you notice here, there's a middle pillar. Right, there are these 4 Sfirot in the middle, and then there are 3 on each side. The left side is often associated with judgment or rigor, but there's a whole, as Shmu alluded to, there's a whole idea that out of the Sfira of Gevura or Din, a whole other 10 Sfirot came, and these are the dark side, and they're sort of the evil Sfirot, right? There's a lot of parallels between Judaism and the Force.
Yeah.
Right? There's sort of the dark side and the light side, right? So the left side is seen as sort of harsher, I would say, in a way, right? So let's go through them just one at a time, and then maybe we'll do some more text, right? So you start at the top there. You see that open thing. That's where the Ein Sof is coming from, and then you have Keter, which is often associated with in the human body with the crown of the head, right? And I say, in the general way, with the third eye, right? It's sort of our ultimate connection to the divine. It also has another name, which is will. If you look here, right, will meaning like it's your will, like willpower, and often they'll say that the first thing that arose within Ein Sof, which was this infinite, beyond time, beyond space thing, was the will to create. The will for there to be something else, for there to be a universe, right? And so that's where Keter comes from. And then Keter flows down, like through the channel, right, to Chokhmah, right? And these channels, by the way, again, are the letters, right? So Chokhmah is wisdom, associated with the it's the right brain, right? It's sort of the unconscious mind. It's sort of the creative. I got the right one. Yes, with the right brain, right? So that's in the physical body, but wisdom is a concept that's not just from Kabbalah, but it's also in Greek philosophy. It's also in Christianity, the idea of the logos. Has anybody ever heard of the logos before? The logos is sort of pure information. It's knowledge in its most primal sense. When Chokhmah was first described to me, it was sort of as your unconscious mind, your deep unconscious mind, all those sort of like your dream mind. And then Chokhmah flows to Binah. Oh, I should also say the right side is considered masculine. The left side is considered feminine. Now, I think it should be noted, though, that it's not necessarily in the male and female sexual sense, but it's more like in the idea of giving and receiving, right? And some of these ideas are, they have sort of a sexist underpinning, right? And that's the other thing I would say about the Zohar, just really quickly, and the Kabbalah in general, is that there is a sort of a dark anti-feminine, anti-woman side to a lot of this stuff. That all being said, Kabbalah has the idea of the goddess, which is pretty incredible. And so when I read the Zohar for 780 days, 1 page a day, I would really be mining through sort of some of the more offensive material to find these real gems of beautiful concepts that are in it, but just they're sort of they're arising out of medieval Spain, which was a certain society, right? So the right side is masculine, the left side is feminine, and so Binah is the third sphira. Binah, whereas Chokhmah is sort of the unconscious mind, Binah is that aspect of your mind that keeps you awake at night, that you can't fall asleep, and your mind's sort of racing and racing and racing and thinking all these thoughts, like what I have to do, or, all those really specific thoughts, total conscious thoughts. That's Binah. Binah is also known as me in Hebrew, which means who, and she is sort of that question. They say that she is where all language comes from. That once you get beyond Binah to Chokhmah and Keter, you're sort of beyond language. You're beyond all conscious linguistic thought. And so she's sort of that gatekeeper. She. Binah is here. Binah is also known as the upper mother. Right? Again, it's sort of a goddess idea, right? Binah is the upper mother. Shekhinah, which is the last sphira, she's also known as Malchut, is the lower mother. So Chokhmah and Binah, and I would also say that maybe I shouldn't bring this in, but I'm going to do it anyway. Chokhmah does also have a feminine sense. Not just because the word is a feminine word in Hebrew, but because there's a quote from Proverbs about wisdom, and she's referred to it's referred to in the feminine, and it's referred to as a little girl who's playing before God as God creates the universe. It's a beautiful image. I think it's Proverbs 8. It's this beautiful image of God sort of having wisdom playing before him as he's creating the universe as this feminine figure. Now, when it comes to the Zohar and Kabbalah, Chokhmah now becomes like the upper father, sort of the grandfather figure. So I had this idea to write a children's book where you have this little girl who turns into this old man.
That's wonderful.
Right. An image of that, right? I should do that, yeah. I've written children's books, by the way. So Binah is sort of that, the conscious mind, the intellect. It's been described to me this way also, Chokhmah and Binah. Chokhmah is like the idea that you're going to build a house, and Binah is the blueprints to the house. And then we have the Sphira of Chesed. And Chesed is associated with the right hand. And Chesed, I like to translate as unbounded love. It's sort of boundaryless energy. It's associated with the forefather Abraham, how he would just invite everybody into his tent. I see it as almost the ultimate extroverted energy. So it's complete unbounded love, just a flow of complete unbounded love. And then Gvura, or Din, or judgment. Gvura means strength, Din means judgment, is the ultimate sort of boundaried. It's a creation of boundaries. It's an inward force. I would say it's almost like the ultimate introvert. That the Gvura or Din is about judgment, right, as opposed to love, right? And I should say again, just to reiterate, like all of these qualities are within us, right, and in our psyche, as part of who we are as human beings, right? We all have unbounded love in us. This desire to just love, innocently, in an unbounded way, an unboundaried way, and we also have, judgment, where we judge other people and we make distinctions between us and other people, right? And then Tiferet is the next Sphira, and you can see it's in the middle there, because it is balance, right? Tiferet means beauty. It's associated with the golden mean, right? Which is sort of the perfect balance of everything.
So would you say that's equivalent to Itachi?
Yes, in a certain sense, right? And if you look at the right, the Chesed and the Gvura, right? Tiferet is the balance of love and judgment, right? Often there's a philosophical concept, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? If Chesed is the thesis, Gevura is the antithesis, Tiferet is the synthesis, right? It's the perfect balance of love and judgment. And this is sort of, right, in a lot of ways, what we're all trying to get to in our lives is this balance between love and judgment. And it has many names besides Tiferet. It's also known as Rachamim, which means compassion. And it's interesting to think that compassion is not just about unboundaried love. Right? Compassion is about a balance between love and judgment. Right? Another name for Tiferet is Emet, which is truth. And so when you come to this point of balance, that's where the truth lies. And it's interesting to think about, sort of in our modern world where we have so many different beliefs and opinions, right? Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. It's the balance of the right and the left, right? The right side of the tree and the left side of the tree, maybe the right and the left politically, right? That you need to come to this point where both Chesed and Gevura are represented in an appropriate way. What more can I say about that? Right, this is one of the human missions on Earth, is to balance ourselves and balance the qualities within ourselves.
Do you mind if I just talk for a second about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in these?
Yeah, go for it.
So, Abraham's approached by those three angels, and he gives salt, and he, after something like 3 days of being circumcised, he runs to them. And that's why he's, one of the reasons why he's unbounded love. But he also sacrifices his son, or tries to. And that's, loving kindness too far, when you want to give your God the ultimate gift of your child, which is to whom your people come from, your only people. So Isaac's associated with Gevurah because Isaac's kind of shell-shocked from that experience. And as you know, Sarah doesn't talk to Abraham for the rest of his life, for the rest of her life. And then they have a child, Jacob, and Jacob is Tiferet because his truth is growing up after taking the birthright from Esau, and he needs to make that beautiful in a way or not. And so a lot of these characteristics, not only do we have them, but we associate them with our fathers, and when we pray to them, they're like in our liturgy, in our poem.
And Jacob has to come to balance in himself, right? He has to he's a twin, first of all, right? Which is, he's got those two sides of himself. He has the Esau side of himself, which is associated with Gevurah, right? Esau is often associated with Gevurah as well as Isaac. So he has the Esau in him. He has the Abraham in him. He needs to find this level of balance, and there's this great story in the Torah right before he meets his brother Esau, after many years of being apart, after running away, after stealing his birthright. He is left alone by himself. He sends out everybody else ahead of him, and he struggles with a man. He wrestles with a man all night. It says a man. Actually, in the original text, it says a man, not an angel. It says a man. And the rabbis say this is the angel of his brother Esau, which is the angel Samael, which is sort of a Jewish devil, but associated with Gevurah, with the left side of the tree.
Which is where the evil side comes from, by the
Right,
way.
which is where the evil side comes from, right? The Samael, which is this angel, is sort of the head of this whole left side. He's the king of the demons, him and Lilith. I could talk about Lilith as well, and the sort of the feminist reclaiming of Lilith, but we're not going to get there today. We'll get there in a later class, right? But so he wrestles with this man, and then he transforms himself, and he gets a new name, right? Yeah. Israel. And Tiferet the word Tiferet is actually not the whole name of the Sphira. The name of the Sphira is Tiferet Yisrael, right? The beauty of Israel, meaning the balance that he got to when he became Israel, instead of just Jacob. So that's Tiferet, and then you have Netzach and Hod, which are associated with the right hip and the left hip, respectively. And I like to think of these as sort of personalities. I associate Netzach, which is from the right side, with sort of a very charismatic, erotic person. Somebody who's very warm and charismatic and puts themselves out there. I associate Netzach as well with Joseph before he kind of goes through his personal transformation, like self-centered, egotistical, right? It's that sort of side of ourselves.
What does it have to do with eternity?
It's an interesting question. What does that have to do with eternity? It's sort of, sometimes it's just the name of the Sphira. But Netzach, lenatseach in modern Hebrew means to win. So
Netzachim is part of one of our prayers, and it's eternity.
Eternity of eternities. But lenatseach means to win. So maybe somebody who's like a winner,
Okay.
Could be maybe that. Right. So and Hod, I would associate with sort of a hermit. The ultimate, introvert. Somebody who doesn't speak up for himself, even. I would say if there was a biblical character I might associate with is Judah before he steps up to take responsibility for his brother Benjamin. I don't know if people are familiar with the story, right? But Judah doesn't, he's part of the selling of Joseph into slavery. He doesn't really speak up for him. He doesn't help him until this final scene where Joseph is going to keep Benjamin and make him, he's really testing them to see if he's going to, he's testing them to see if he's going to do the same thing that he did with him. And Judah steps up and he says, "Take me instead." Right? And this is this moment where he steps out of hod, which is like somebody who sort of shirks responsibility, and he steps up into responsibility and into leadership, and that's where I would say Yesod is, right? Is the balance between these two qualities, right? The balance between sort of humility and pride. Right? And maybe that's a simpler way of saying everything I just said, right? Which is Netzach is like pride, and Hod is sort of like humility, right? And Yesod is that balance. And Yesod is often means foundation. It's often associated with the phallus, and it is seen as the final step before Shekhinah, which is the final Sphira, which is associated with the feminine, and associated with the Tzaddik. The Tzaddik is the righteous person, right? They say that 36 Tzaddikim keep the world going, right? The Tzaddik is somebody who's completely righteous. And in Hasidism, the tzaddikim were like the Hasidic masters, right? So that's Yesod, and Shekhinah is the presence of God that is palpable and felt in this world, right? Shekhinah is the immanent God, or I should say goddess, because Shekhinah is feminine, and she is seen as being the vessel into which all of these sfirot pour their light. She is the culmination of all of these sfirot. And right, back to a concept I talked about last time, which is theurgy, right, which is that we are sort of responsible for taking this diagram of God, these different aspects of God, and balancing them in the world and within ourselves. And by doing that, because God is sort of out of balance in this world, by doing that, by making that balance, we allow the flow of this energy to come down through all of these pipelines into the world, into Shekhinah, and into the world. Right? We allow God to come into the world through balancing all of these qualities within ourselves and within the world. And if Kabbalah would say that the Zohar in particular would say that there's something wrong with the world, they would say is that these are out of balance. And in particular, Shekhinah is not receiving the flow from the upper sfirot, from the upper worlds. And there's a beautiful text that sort of gives us a little taste of what the stories and the poetry in the Zohar is like that describes this. It's in this book, the Zohar. I think it's the first text in here. No, it's not the first text here. Where is it? It's number 5. It's page 19. So most of the time, as I said, the Zohar is based on the Parsha of the week, Torah portion of the week, and most of the time it will take the words of the Torah portion and it will reinterpret them in a way that is completely different than what you would think from the face value of the words. So it'll take a word and it will make it completely different than you might understand it. And often what it does is it speaks in a hyper-literal way, meaning that it doesn't recognize the idioms as idioms, but it actually uses the words to be a different sort of meaning. But let's dive in so that I can describe it, but better to just read it, right? So it's quoting this quote from Genesis 3:23 to 24. This is right after Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it says, Yud He Vav He Elohim, which are two names of God. You can look at the footnotes here. Expelled him from the garden. He drove out et Adam. Now the word et, he translated it as et here because it doesn't have any semantic meaning. It has grammatical meaning. So if you study modern Hebrew or any Hebrew, the word et is the direct object marker. So it allows you to identify the direct object in the sentence. And that's how it's used in the Torah. And it's sort of a grammatical thing so that you know what the direct object is. Right? That's the word et. But the Zohar takes the word et, and they feel, the authors of the Zohar feel that every single word, every single letter in the Torah is significant and has actual meaning and significance, and so they can't say it's just a grammatical thing, right? So they're gonna make a whole reinterpretation of the story of Adam based upon this one word et, which has no actual semantic meaning in if you're a grammarian study grammar, Hebrew grammar. Can I get somebody to read here? Volunteer?
I'll read. Rabbi Elazar said, "We do not know who divorced whom, if the Blessed Holy One divorced Adam or not. But the word is transposed. He drove out et precisely. Who drove out et? Adam. Adam actually drove out et. Consequently, it is written, Yud He Vav He Elohim expelled him from the Garden of Eden. Why did he expel him? Because Adam drove out et."
Okay, let's rewind it here. Okay, so let's first of all look at some of these footnotes, this gives you a very small idea of the kind of footnotes that are in the larger Pritzker edition, right? So footnote number 2, et Adam. Grammatically, the word et is an accusative particle. As I said, it has no independent meaning and is lost in translation, but in rabbinic tradition, it often amplifies the original meaning of a biblical verse. Here, this word inspires Rabbi Elazar to create a mystical midrash that hints at the true nature of Adam's sin. So the word here, expelled or drove out, footnote number 3, if the Blessed Holy One divorced Adam. Some commentators that have interpreted the Hebrew word vayegaresh, he drove out or expelled him, as related to gerushin or divorce. It's the same word as divorce, implying that Adam was divorced by God, like a wife who has committed an indecent act. Right. So, next. Now we're going to go a little... So he drove out et. Right? If you look at the top quote here, right, it says he drove out et Adam. So he drove out et. Who drove out et? Adam. Right? So that's the way they're interpreting here. Right? So there should almost be a...
he drove out et Adam.
Right. Adam is the one who drove out et. Right? There should almost be like a dash or something. Right? He drove out et Adam. Adam is the one that drove out et from the garden, right? So he drove out et Adam. So Adam is the one who drove out et. Well, what is et then? Well, et is the letters Aleph and Taf, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which means that according to Kabbalah, it is the Shekhinah, because the Shekhinah is everything, from Aleph to Taf. From Alpha to Omega, right? So, et here, according to the Zohar and Kabbalah, is Shekhinah. So footnote number 4, et precisely spelled with the two Hebrew letters Aleph and Taf, is also the Zohar's codename for Shekhinah, who symbolizes divine speech, the entire alphabet from Aleph to Taf. Once Et was driven out of the garden, language itself became corrupt and remained so until the revelation of the Torah at Sinai. Number 5, Adam actually drove out Et. The nature of Adam's sin is a tightly guarded secret. Here the Zohar suggests that his sin was driving out Et, Shekhinah. He does this by partaking solely of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, also a symbol of Shekhinah, thus separating her from the other Sfirot. Right? This is not just what Adam did, this is what we do. Right? This is the primal fault in our world, is that we separate Shekhinah from the rest of the Sfirot. So he does this, thus separating her from the other Sfirot, divorcing her from her husband Tiferet Yisrael. Further, he disrupts the divine-human connection by casting out Shekhinah and losing awareness of God's presence. On a psychological level, he separates consciousness from the unconscious. All right, so I think this is an incredible text here, right? So it's saying, well, what's the sin of Adam? What's the sin of Adam? Anybody want to say what the sin of Adam was, according to this text here? Anybody understand what I just talked about?
Yeah.
I don't agree with it, but
It's-
I know what you said.
Right? So the idea is that Adam separated out one piece of God from the rest. Right? And not only this, which is so interesting given our world that we live in, right? The divine feminine has been separated out from the rest of God. And this is the basic sin of humanity, right? That we separate out the divine feminine from the rest of God, meaning we see it as a separate entity, right? We see the divine in the world as a separate entity from the divine that is transcendent. Right?
We see
we're almost
10
done.
separate,
It's right. We see
whoever drew that diagram separated out everything else.
right, and back to the original point, right? That they are all one, right? Right. That's the basic point of Kabbalah, right? And that's the basic idea that Adam messed up here, right? That they are all one. That there is no separation between any of them. So I want to end with a nigun. I have 1 minute. Anybody have 30 seconds of a comment they'd like to give before we... Yeah.
What does it mean he separated out if God is one? What did Adam do?
Yeah, he partook
Did
solely
he-
of the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
That's like a 4-hour conversation.
Right. We could have an entire session just talking about what that means.
Yeah, I have a quick comment, which is that you can't read these stories as you would the stories of the Torah. It's kind of like when you listen to classical music, or you listen to rock and roll, and then you listen to jazz. Jazz plays by multiple scales. It jumps around. It uses symbols and motifs in a way that is totally foreign to classic rock, for instance, or to classical music. And so, at least when I studied Kabbalah at my school, the homework assignments had to do with first understanding what the text means of itself in the Torah, then understanding what the drash meant, which is this is Pardes, going back to the story Ben told the other class. You have, Peshat, which is what the text says. You have Drash, which is what is kind of implied and what the rabbis put there. You have Remez, which is what is hidden and kind of has to be uncovered. And then Sod, that's the mystical stuff that will never be proven, that you can't actually say finitely this is the meaning. But when you believe in it, it has certain implications for how you relate to other things.
And Sod has many different valences, right? There's many different ways to understand it. It's like poetry, right? So we have about 30 seconds. So I'd like to end with the same nigun that we started off with. I think in our next session we'll do a couple more texts from the Zohar, as well as the topic of the week. The next session is in 2 weeks, I think. So I will send out an email the week before just to remind everybody.
How do we get, some people have seen you electronically? How do we? Is
Yeah,
that
what's
on?
the,
It's available on my Facebook page, so you have to have a Facebook.
We have to friend you.
Yeah, you can friend me. Yes, for
Oh,
sure.
okay.
Yeah.
There's no other way?
Then going on Facebook,
Correct.
I could possibly transfer it to another kind of video if you're interested, and I could send it to you perhaps. All right, so let's end with a nigun. We have 30 seconds. Thank you all. I'll see you in 2 weeks.